Thank you, James. I'm so happy to be here, happy to be here with you. The last time I was in this city, I gave a talk at the Rotman School of Business at UT's campus, not too far from here. So that was in September of last year. So I'm glad to be back in Canada, glad to be back here. I heard that the legal framework in Canada changed recently, made it kind of interesting. I'm sure everyone here is clean and sober and ready to listen. So again, my name is Anwan Simmons, and I want to talk about leadership. Leadership is a topic that I've loved for a long time. And I've been a lead of engineering teams for almost 20 years, starting with my days at Accenture and Deloitte. And it's really a tough job. And one reason that I love Agile software development so much is that there's so many leadership principles in Agile. And we normally don't think of it that way. We think about Agile being a way to build software in a way that's iterative, where we can, with flexibility, build software sprint after sprint. But I really do think that there's a lot of great leadership lessons in the Agile Manifesto. And I really think that a large part of my journey through leadership has landed with the Agile Manifesto, but I do want to share with you a little bit about my own leadership journey. Now, my leadership journey started when I was young, and I was a big comic book nerd and science fiction nerd, so I always was drawn to stories about leaders in comic books and fantasy. So any comic book or science fiction construct, I always liked who was the leader, right? Transformers, Optimus Prime. Whether it was in Star Trek, Captain Picard, right? I always loved the leaders in those stories. And one reason that I loved those stories so much is that these are stories about heroes. And I learned that there was a person who wrote about heroes, and the fact that these stories, whether it's Star Wars or Star Trek or Lord of the Rings, you see this cycle of heroes. And so Joseph Campbell, who I discovered in college, wrote a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. Anyone heard about this book? Heard about Campbell, right? So Joseph Campbell wrote this book, and it's a great book, but one of the passages I love the most is really this one, who summarizes kind of this cycle, right? So a hero emerges from the common world. They encounter these wondrous forces. They finally achieve a decisive victory. Maybe they throw the ring into Mount Doom. Maybe they fire into the secret slot in the Death Star, but they get some victory. And then they come back to the real world with some kind of boon or with some kind of gift. And I really liked how Joseph Campbell went through this cycle. So when you think about it, it really works like this. And there are lots of ways that I've seen Campbell's kind of leadership, but Campbell's hero's journey written. But I really like this version here. And so you have these phases, right? So you have these 4 parts. Part 1, the hero's call to adventure. Part 2, they go through some extreme trials. Part 3, the hero is transformed. And then part 4, they go back home, right? And I began to see in these 4 major parts of the hero's journey, my story. And so we kind of drill down into how it works, right? So when they're called to adventure, there's that kind of, they're in the ordinary world, but they're hesitant for some reason. But then they meet a mentor. And this mentor is someone who guides them, right? So that might be Gandalf, might be Dumbledore, could be someone who guides the hero. And then they go through trials, they go through some ordeal, and then they get a reward. And then they finally get back on the road home. And so when I was learning about leadership, I saw my career in many ways mapped to this journey, right? And one key thing about Campbell's cycle is that division between the common world and the fantastic world, right? And often in software, we kind of have that same transition. And at least I went through that, where I was a college student and working in the common world, but then you go into the world of code, and you're going in through understanding how you can build really almost anything from nothing. And I began to go through this same leadership journey. And I went through trials. One of my courses in undergrad was Data Structures in C. Anybody take that course? That almost took me out. I almost became a bio major after that course. But I persisted and I continued. And so I saw really my leadership journey very much like this one. And, you know, the idea of a hero bringing back gifts is many ways how we deliver software, right? The idea is that we go through a lot of trials, we go through, if you work in Agile, sprints, and hopefully you deliver a gift, some release that ideally will solve someone's problem, right? And so I really began to hone and understand how my own leadership journey is tied to Campbell's cycle. And I've seen, because I've worked in software development for a lot of years, this cycle continue from project after project. And so I began to see how my leadership journey maps here. But I really want to focus on this part, right? And that's the mentor part. Because really, in many ways, if you are a leader, you're a mentor. In many ways, a leader is someone who's already gone on the journey, right? We've seen every dragon, we've slain all the orcs, we've killed, and they seem to make a lot of Death Stars, so we kill every Death Star. But then we go back and we show other people starting that journey how it works. And I find that a lot of the way that I lead my teams is really this mentorship relationship that's part of Campbell's cycle. And I began to really understand that this cycle of a person who goes through trials to become a leader and then they give back to someone starting that journey, I began to see that over and over again. In fact, one of the most popular myths of our time is Star Wars. And you see this cycle here, right? You have Qui-Gon, who was a leader who passed on to another person, who passed it on to the next person, who passed it on to the next person, right? So you see this cycle of leadership, right? A leader passing it on down. Now, I'm not sure who Rey's going to pass it on down to. Hope she finds someone. But this cycle continues, and we see it a part of stories all throughout fantasy and sci-fi. But I think that many of you have also gone through this. Maybe you had a leader, someone who passed on to you how software development works. And I hope that you haven't forgotten those lessons and that you've passed it on as well. Now, there's one problem with Star Wars is that you have to have a lightsaber to pass it on. I don't have one of those. And so as I matured, I began to find, well, what are some really good books about leadership? What are some ways that I can learn about leadership? And I found a couple. One is by John C. Maxwell, which he talked about 21 Laws of Leadership. And it's a great book. I highly recommend that you check it out either on Amazon or your library. And one of the key things that I took from this book, from Maxwell's Laws of Leadership, is really this. And that's the law of influence. And Maxwell posited that we talk about leadership in a lot of ways, and a lot of people think about leadership in terms of title, right? When I get the title, I'm a leader. When I become a development lead or an engineering manager or a Scrum master or a project manager, that's when I become a leader. And true, titles are important, but titles are not leadership. One of the true measures of leadership is influence, and that's the ability to nudge your team in the right direction. And really, when you boil down leadership, and I fully believe this, leadership is influence. Leadership is the ability to influence your team. All a title can do is buy you time to build your influence. So I began to see that influence was something that I needed to really understand when I was leading my teams. How can I be an influencer with my teams? And I found another book by McGregor Burns called, surprisingly, Leadership. And again, another great book that I recommend you checking out, but I wanted to draw this point out from this book. McGregor Burns talked about two types of leadership, right? There's transactional leadership, whereas I have rewards and I have punishments. And since I'm the leader, I will reward you or punish you based on how you perform. And I think we've all worked with people like that. Maybe some of you are transactional leaders. I'm not a fan of transactional leaders, though they can be very effective. I like to be a transformational leader. And Burns described this as someone who uses their personality, their enthusiasm to influence followers. And this is the type of leader that I've really molded myself on. I want to be that charismatic, that energetic leader that influences my teams to reach a higher level of performance. And as I began to go through my leadership journey, I began to understand that if I'm going to be the leader that I want to be, then I really need to learn how can I influence my teams? How can I make sure that I nudge them in the right direction in order to be successful? And so as I began to think through, well, how can I build my influence and how can I think about this? I began to think about, code smells. Anybody heard about code smells, that term, right? And so, code smells where, this code works and it runs, but something's kind of weird. Something, it maybe the methods are too huge, or we haven't really, there's a lot of technical debt that we need to take care of. And so it's the ability to understand that something's going on with this code base, right? So I began to think about, well, are there influence smells? Are there ways that I can detect that the team's working, right? We're going through our sprints, we're getting our story points done, but are there things that aren't working well with my team that I need to look into? So I began to think about what can I do to understand these influence smells. And so as I began to do this, I began to think about my journey through Scrum. Now, my first Scrum team was back in 2004, right? So I've been doing this for a very long time. And when I first started doing Scrum, I thought, okay, it's just a meeting where you stand up, I guess. That's kind of cool. The meeting's quick. But then I began to practice Scrum time over time. And I began to realize that, there's really just so much to Scrum and the Agile than just daily stand-ups. And I began to became a certified Scrum Master, and I began to really understand the power of Scrum. But to understand the leadership lessons in Scrum, we really have to go back to the beginning, right? We have to go back to February 2001 when 17 people gathered in Utah at a snow lodge called Snowbird. And it's probably kind of like this. It was cold, a little bit more snow. And so these 17 people gathered to talk about how can we build software better. Right, they've been through the waterfall software of that time where you do all this upfront big bang planning, and they saw all of the fallacies and all the failures of waterfall software development. So they came to ski and to talk about how can we build software better. They clearly also talked about diversity and inclusion too during this time. In that these were all 17 white men, but it was 2001. We've come a long way. So, most of you have worked in Scrum, but you may not have heard about the Agile Manifesto. So I just want to go through this before I go through the actual lessons. And so the first part of the Agile Manifesto, you can Google this online and find it, and that is we are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others do it. Now, a lot of people skip over this part of the manifesto, but this is key because these 17 men weren't saying that we're chiseling in stone these hard and fast values that will never change or that will never change in how they are applied. Right? They knew that they were uncovering. And if you're involved in software development, you're also uncovering. You're also uncovering better ways, I hope you are, of building software by building software. So I hope that you don't think that the Agile Manifesto or the Scrum practices or the ceremonies are all just kind of ironclad rules for how you build software. I hope you understand that it was one way of thinking about software, and it's very effective, but you're also uncovering. We're all uncoverers trying to find better ways to build software. So I don't want to gloss that over. So they began to go through these values, and these are the 4 values of the manifesto, right? Individuals and interactions. I'm going to go through these in more detail, but they were saying that process is important, tools are important, but really it's the individuals involved that we need to optimize. Working software, right? There's no better way to measure progress than working code, right? It's not about mock-ups. It's not about beautiful InVision, high-fidelity mock-ups. Is the software running? And let me see what it looks like, right? Collaborating with customers. We can't just focus on the contract. I'm sure most of you have a statement of work somewhere that's signed, that legal people have reviewed, but you gotta have a collaborative relationship with your customers if you want to effectively build software. And then finally, responding to change. We all make plans. Many of our plans are probably in Jira, in a sprint backlog, in a product backlog, or maybe use some other tool. Plans are important, but there's one thing that you know about a plan is that plans are just where you start, right? A plan is just a way that you can respond to change. Because you can say, this is what we thought when we started this project, but things have changed, and this plan lets us know how we can change from where we started, right? So those are the 4 values, and just to finish it out, right, the items on the right are valuable, but the items on the left are more valuable, right? So these are the 4 values from the Agile Manifesto. So I want to go through these 4 values in the time that I have left, and try to share with you leadership lessons that I've taken from these 4 values, right? So the first one, individuals and interactions over processes and tools. And I really think that this is a key part that every leader, this is a key value that every leader here can take to help you build your influence with your teams. So what does this mean? So this Agile value means that, for now at least, you need people to build code, right? Maybe one day we'll have machines and AI that will write itself, and then they're gonna probably kill all of us because you don't need humans anymore, but hopefully Skynet will come online for a few years, a few decades. But for now, we need people. So if you accept that as a truism, that we need people to build software, then you really need to optimize the people that are building your software. And this really isn't just any people, right? One of the key principles of Agile is that we hire motivated individuals. And I'm sure all of you went through an interview for your job, or maybe you've interviewed software developers, but if you're not screening for motivation, then you might want to add that, right? I work with many talented people who aren't very motivated. And so my job as the manager, the leader, guess what? I got to motivate this person every single day. And I've done that before. I understand why that's an important part of leadership. But if they come in the door motivated, then that frees you up to work on other parts of your project. And so, there are a lot of ways that companies have tried to motivate their dev team. We have the whole open concept space, right? Many of you probably work in an open space where just maybe a bullpen, and they may have pool tables, and they may have even like arcade games, or maybe they have, like a keg in the corner somewhere. And I understand that these are cool ways, and when you're looking for budget for building out your space, you may think about this. But I find that these things don't really motivate people, right? It may make them comfortable, but these aren't really motivators for your people. And there are lots of ways that I've read to motivate people. Daniel Pink wrote a great book on this, about how you motivate people, and there's been other books about this. But if there's one thing I've taken away from this Agile value, is the key to motivating people is that you must preserve dignity at all costs. You have to preserve dignity at all costs. And it's easy to dignify people you like. It's easy to dignify people who you work well with. But as a leader, you have to dignify people who disagree with you, even people who you don't like. So if you're going to honor dignity, you have to honor the dignity of everyone on your team. And that's how you build influence. And as you build influence with the people on your team, guess what? They're going to trust you more. They're going to be better enabled to follow you by focusing on making sure that I'm going to preserve the dignity of everyone on this team. You're building a more effective engineering team. And so let me give you an example of how I went through this in my career. So at a company a few years ago, we used a tool called Slack. Anybody use Slack? Everyone knows about Slack, right? Some of you may be weird, so you might use HipChat or Skype or, I'm kidding. But so we were using Slack. And I like Slack a lot. I like Slack as a tool. And so I joined this company and they were using something else. And I said, why not use Slack? So I used my influence. I convinced them to use Slack, and we began to get more people into our Slack channels. And I loved it because we were having great conversations, and we were having this emoji secret language that we understood, and you had animated GIFs that were able to communicate different things. So we had almost a culture in our Slack channel. Well, one day, a coworker made a joke about bacon in one of the Slack channels, and I thought, okay, well, that was funny. That was kind of cool. But the next day, another coworker came to me in private and said that they were offended by the joke about bacon. And I was like, well, I don't understand. It was just a joke. I mean, who doesn't love bacon? And does everyone love bacon? I mean, I didn't have my bacon this morning. I'm kind of grumpy. Everyone loves bacon, right? Well, this coworker happened to be a Muslim, and she told me that the joke was offensive based on how it was stated. And I was like, oh, wow, I hadn't thought about that. And so I thought, well, what do I do with this, right? As a leader, what do I do with this? And so I realized that it was far more important to dignify this person's feelings and sensibilities than to let this go in Slack. And so I pinned a code of conduct to the Slack channel and said that we're a company that honors everyone. And we want to make sure that what we post here, even if it's supposed to be humorous, is in that spirit. And so by doing that, I saw activity dip a little bit, but this person who brought this concern to me, our relationship got a lot better. And they eventually became one of the most productive members of my team, and I believe that's because I dignified her concerns. And I outranked her. I was several levels above her, but dignity always outranks the chain of command. You really have to always walk in dignity if you want to be able to really influence your teams. And so I really want to encourage all of you to, as you think about this and think about the people that you lead, how can I honor the dignity of the people on my team? What can I do to make sure that everyone, regardless of what they look like, maybe their race or their gender or any other measure, what can I do to dignify the people on my team? And I really want to say that it's very important that you speak dignity, right? Dignity has to be spoken, because people tend to do something where there's silence. Where there's silence, people fill in the blanks with their assumptions. So you have to be on record as a leader that's going to dignify the people who are working with you. So let's talk about the next Agile value, right? Working software. We all love working software. And I think that by influencing what your team builds, you'll grow your influence as a leader. Now, a lot of people think that, well, working software means we don't do documentation, and that's not true, right? We don't build encyclopedias of documentation when we do Agile. We usually document just enough to understand what we're doing, and that's it, right? And I write documentation, and you can look in my Jira instance all the time. In Jira, in Confluence, I'm constantly documenting what's going on. So it doesn't mean that we don't document, but it means that we don't do excessive documentation. And I want to focus on this because as leaders, ultimately, we're responsible for getting things working. Yes, we have engineers working on our teams. Yes, we have people who do DevOps. Yes, we have QE or QA testers doing that. But in many ways, our measure, what is going to be used to really determine are we good leaders or bad leaders, is do we get things working? And so this is how I distill this lesson, and that's working always ships faster than perfect, right? Working always ships faster than perfect. And this is more than just software. As a software engineering leader, you will build more than just software. And many of you are working on items today that's not code, right? You might be working on your status report. You might be working on the risk register where you're logging things that are going wrong on your project, but you're building something. And I found that getting something working is much better than focusing on getting it perfect, right? Perfect never ships. And so you have to focus on what can I do to make this ship. So for example, a few years ago, I was working on a project, and so we were trying to figure out our support strategy, right? So this wasn't about software. This was the fact that our customers in China had a problem because there was not enough coverage at nighttime. So we had someone in the Americas and someone in the UK, but there was about a 3-hour window where there wasn't any coverage. And so as you would guess, something went wrong during that 3-hour window, and so they were calling and logging tickets, no response for hours. And so they were saying, anyone, you got to fix this. And so I got into a room with my other leads, and we were doing time zone math, and we were trying to figure out, okay, here are the time zones in America, here are the time zones in Europe, and here's the time zones in China, and we were doing all these charts, and I was like, look, let's just make this simple. Got a guy in India. This person can cover all the gap, but let's just give this person an email address and a phone, and let's see what happens. And so that's what we did. We just simply did that. I left a room full of whiteboards covered in markings with a simple solution. And guess what? We tried it for a month. There were no calls. And so that simple fix saved us a lot of time because working always ships faster than perfect. And you know what? Getting something working is a great way of figuring out how to use it, right? If you build something that's just good enough that will fix the immediate problem, and then you have it go through kind of first contact with what's going on, you'll have a better idea of how to make it better, right? So don't focus on perfect, focus on working, and then iterate from there. Okay, so the next Agile value is about our customers. I'm sure everyone in here has customers. Maybe you don't have external customers, but you have people who expect work from you. And so this Agile value will talk about how can we build our influence with our customers? How can the people who use the products that our teams build be helped by what we do, right? And so I do want to pause and say that even though in Agile we prioritize working with our customers over contracts, that does not mean we don't have contracts. We all have statements of work, and the contract is really important, but a contract is really there to help people feel comfortable. On top of that comfort, you have to build relationships. And so we focus on working with our customers. And so this is how I explain this leadership lesson. That's customers trust colleagues, not contracts. Your customers, the people you work with every day, probably will never read a statement of work. You should. Please read your statements of work. If you work under statements of work, you should understand the contractual obligations of your teams, but they don't read that, right? I've never had a customer in times of stress pull out the statement of work to feel better about the problem, right? No, they pull you to the side and they say, this is going horribly, what do we do? And the best way to lubricate those tough situations is relationships. We have to build relationships with our customers, and the best way to do that is treating them as colleagues, right? If I have a customer, I don't think of them as someone outside my company, right? They're a colleague, just like the people who have the same company on LinkedIn that I do, right? They're colleagues. And if we are able to work in that manner, we'll get far better results. And the way that I really experienced this is a few years ago again in another company. I've been working for a long time, so I work for multiple companies. So another company, we were working on these interfaces. And so, we were based in Houston, Texas, and our partner was based in San Francisco. And so there was a lot of miles between our two companies. And so we were speccing out these interfaces. So, well, how can we make our software talk to their software? And so we were doing Agile, and they were doing Agile. And so we thought, well, let's just have them kind of have, we'll have our sprint backlog, they'll have their backlog, and we'll just kind of go in parallel. I was like, that's not going to work. I tried that before. It never works because you're going to get out of sync almost immediately. So what we're going to do is this. We're going to have one Scrum team split between 2 locations. So we're going to have one backlog, we're going to have one daily stand-up, we're going to work like we're one team, even though the people have badges with different companies on them. And by doing that, by treating them like colleagues, we got much better results. We were able to finish our integration ahead of schedule, and then the other departments began to do the same thing, like marketing did it, and the other teams began to have this one team, different companies approach, and I got much better results by treating my customer as a colleague and not just a contract written somewhere. All right, so now we talked about influence with our teams and our product and our customers. We need to talk about how do we influence the schedule? How do we influence the schedule? Because responding to change is important because we all have schedules that are written somewhere, but the reality is that schedules change because reality change. And so we have to understand that there's always new growth in software development. There's always something new that you have to deal with. If you think that you can solve a problem and never see it again, you probably haven't been leading teams for very long. You're going to have to solve either the same problem or new problems over and over and over again, right? And that's because the future is notoriously hard to predict. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, even in the next 30 minutes. So we have to be responsive. We have to build change into how we think about our software projects. And, I boiled this down into this, right? Don't fear surprises, fear inflexibility, right? Don't be afraid of surprises. Don't be afraid when something happens that you did not expect. What you should be afraid of is your inability to respond to that change. So the key to being flexible is being comfortable navigating surprise. And the way that I do this is that I always build flexibility into any schedule that I build. And that helps me be well positioned to handle any surprises, right? So I learned this at a company where we were building this software, and the customer said that we need to do an accessibility audit, right? Anybody have been through an accessibility audit, right? Where they audit your software, and if you have a H1 tag, or if you have an H2 tag, you have to have an H1 tag. And so we had this audit that another company did. We got this big report of all the ways that our product was not accessible. So my job was to lead the team through figuring out how we're going to solve these 231 violations of the accessibility rules. And so again, I began working with my counterparts, and so we began having these multi-hour, multi-day meetings going through every single violation, trying to figure out, okay, what are we going to do about each one? And I said, we're building and investing so much time into this rigid structure that's going to be false tomorrow. So why don't we do this? Let's just stack rank the violations from high, medium, and low, and let's just slot them into time slices. I didn't call them sprints because they didn't understand Agile, and let's just work on them that way. And so by doing that, I gave myself flexibility, and I didn't have to figure out how I was going to do every single violation. I just need to figure out what I'm going to do for the next 2 weeks. And by doing that, I began to get the team really geared to begin solving these. And every 2 weeks, we learned something that helped us go through the violations in the next 2 weeks. And by doing that, we were able to close our violations a lot faster than the other teams that also had audits done, right? So by giving myself flexibility, I helped myself avoid some of the nasty surprises that would have happened if we tried to do all this, big upfront planning. And so that strategy really helped me be successful, right? So these are the 4 leadership lessons from the Agile Manifesto, right? So preserve dignity at all costs. Working always ships faster than perfect. Customers trust colleagues, not contracts. And don't fear surprises, fear, and flexibility. And I really think that these lessons will help you build your ability to detect influence smells, right? What's sticking up with my customers or my team or my product or my schedule? Where do I need to impose myself to make sure that I'm representing my team and my schedule and my work effectively? And, leadership is about making decisions. And I think that you'll find these 4 lessons a great set of tests to just run through to figure out what can I do to make a decision that will help my team, right? Will this decision hurt my team by not preserving their dignity? Will this decision influence my team's ability to build by focusing too much on perfect software? Am I hurting my customer in some way by making this decision, right? We've all heard about news reports about, software gone bad. Volkswagen had an issue where they built their vehicles to have their emissions not be what they actually were, right? So Volkswagen took a hit by doing that. And we've heard about many of you can think about examples of how software teams have gone through the exact same thing, where they've hurt their customers, right? And you know what, when I think about that, about Volkswagen, right, some manager or some executive went to a developer and said, can you fake the emissions, right? And that engineer should have said, no, I can't do that, because that's illegal, right? And somewhere that broke down, right? Somewhere someone didn't have the bravery to say, this is gonna hurt our customers, right? This is gonna hurt us. And they didn't make that decision. And really, these also stack together, right? So you may have, for example, this great, 10x engineer who can just knock out code, and they're really great. So they help you build software, but they're toxic, right? People don't like working with this person. They're offensive, right? So what do? Do you keep this person around and say nothing and let the team hurt? Or do you say, you know what, I need to be a leader, and I need to make sure that the dignity of my team is protected? So no matter where you are on your journey as an engineering leader or as a leader, I really hope that if you optimize your influence with your people, your build, your customers, and your schedule, then you're maximize the trust that people put in you and with your team. And I think that that's a great way to become a leader that will build great software for customers for years to come. So I really hope that the next time you face a leadership decision, that you look to the Agile Manifesto for a set of instincts. All right? Thank you. All right, so we have time for Q&A. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand, and I'd be happy to answer them. There are mics available. There's a person in the back. So I'll wait till the mic gets to you. So if you could tell me your name and your question.
Sure, my name's Matt. Excuse me. Sometimes, especially when it comes to getting your customer to collaborate, you've got a business team member who protects the account or wants to do a grand reveal at the end, not a collaborative process throughout. How do you sell that particular idea upstream to the business side, or is there an effective byline to bring them in?
Yeah, Matt, that is a challenge, right? So you have someone on your side who's kind of saying, let's not, reveal how we're making the sausage to the customer, maybe until the end, right? Maybe after they've written that last check, and then we can kind of show them, what's going on. So and I've been fortunate to rarely have that experience. I've been very lucky, I think, to work with companies that honor transparency, radical transparency. But there have been times when I've had someone who was more, and this person was not slimy, but they hated writing anything in email because it was like documented. There's like a paper trail, so they always wanted to call people or go in person. They literally said, "Don't send emails to the customer. Do things in person." And I was like, the way that I handle that is that I always explain things in terms of impact, right? What is the impact of this? Not just to us, but to what we're building and to the schedule. And always link the impact to someone on the customer side who needs to make a decision. So, I've worked for most of my life in the consulting aspect. So there's usually an engagement manager on the on our side and an engagement manager on the customer side. So I always make sure that, look, if we don't do anything about this, this horrible thing, to kind of take it to the extreme, then this is going to have an impact on our schedule. We will slip unless we get this over to the customer in the next couple of weeks, because we're basically blocked by this. And if you always frame things in terms of this is the risk or this is the issue, and I highly recommend that you maintain a risk and issue log in Confluence or even in Excel. And you can have this is one that's internal to us. This is one that is visible to the customer, and I've done that before. Then you have a place to put that, right? Document that risk, document that issue, and then always bring in other people. So hopefully you have a manager who wants to kind of keep things close and keep things away from the customer. Always push for other people on your side, right? Other managers, other people, because there's usually not one person to say, hey, I want to have just a weekly review of risk and issues that I'm finding. We can do it every Friday. And by doing that, you're just keeping yourself from being bottled by this one person. And you're hopefully getting air support coverage from other people that will have hopefully the courage to say, you know what, I need to talk to Jennifer on the customer side about this. That's how I've handled that in the past, right? Document, reveal, be as open as you can internally. And usually by doing that and linking it to a decision on the customer side, you'll get enough leeway, more runway to get it resolved. Does that help, Matt?
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. All right.